Hello and welcome to another session of Inside Festival, where we talk about artificial intelligence and the ever-increasing interconnectedness of the world with regard to the festival topics of autonomy and democracy. It is with pleasure that I introduce our guest today, Joanna Bryson. She's a professor of ethics and technology at the Hertie School in Berlin. Her research focuses on the impact of technology, to be more specific, artificial intelligence and information and communication technology on human cooperation. From 2002 to 2019, she was on the computer science faculty at the University of Bath. She has also been affiliated with the Department of Psychology at Harvard University, the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oxford, the School of Social Sciences at the University of Mannheim, and the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. She has also taken part in a lot of formats in this festival. For example, she gave a keynote on Friday 11th from 7:30 to 8:15, and she took part in the radicalization by design panel. And it's also a pleasure to introduce Gerfried Stocker, our artistic director, who has also a background in information technology as well, which could be interesting. So, Joanna, for starters, I wanted to talk about a specific paper you wrote, which is co-authored, which is very interesting. I mean, of course, all your papers are interesting, but I want to specifically talk about the impact of AI on human behavior. And could you maybe flesh out some of the key points of the paper? I'm talking about the narrative about AI and the idea of AI as prosthetic nervous system and prosthetic memory.
All right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, and I hope I'm unmuted. Secondly, congratulations. I'm really sorry I'm not in Linz, but I love the artistic direction the year that I was there before, so I wish I was there this year. It was touch and go. We almost did it, but just didn't seem it was the best year for traveling. Yeah, so, and I think you've probably read that paper more recently than I did. I mean, it came out pretty recently, or I'm not, no, I don't think it even has come out. It's coming out in 2021, but we wrote it, of course, last year. So, but in general, I think the best understanding of artificial intelligence and of technology more generally is of enhancing humans and or human agencies. Right. So sometimes we use a technology like the smartphone. Well, your smartphone is both making you more powerful and more able to do things, but it's also sort of making you an extension of quite a lot of corporations who are gathering information about you or through you, even if it's not about you. I remember the first time that I saw a Google map that gave the pedestrian directions that involved a break in a fence, And clearly, Google had not mapped the break in the fence, but rather had tracked where people were walking just by seeing where they were walking, And so they're building up advice to people, route planning advice based on that. And sometimes that can go horribly wrong because at one time, in fact, speaking of Oxford, I was late somewhere and I was using the Google map to get across like a bunch of parks and things. And I wound up being somewhere that only students could get through the door because they all have swipe cards. And again, they were the main people walking back there. So Google has no idea that I didn't have a swipe card and all the students had a swipe card. And so I was just stuck there until somebody came through. So, but anyway, the point is not that, the AI isn't perfect. Of course, no intelligence is perfect. AI is just a combination of our intelligence. But the point is that, going back to the question you asked, that it changes what we know and how we perceive. And, you mentioned that I study artificial intelligence and I study ICT, the information communication technology. But I think the most foundational thing about information communication technology is the digital. It is the fact that we can move something of value so far, so effectively, and so inexpensively, so quickly. It's not instantaneous, it's not cheap, it's not perfect. We do lose a little bit of information, but still it's a fundamental change from the way transportation has worked in the past. And that changes what governance does. It changes the nature of business, obviously, and it changes the nature of conferences. But I think that's part of why we see a lot of the disruption we see right now is because governance through governments can't work as it has done previously. So we need to, when we innovate technology, particularly when it changes communication, both like human communication, like talking, but also communication in the more technical, physical sense of just transporting between regions, then we have to also come up with innovations to handle the governance problems that emerge from that. And I think that's the stage we're in right now, which is why I've moved to a governance school.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then I want to come back to the narratives about AI. We already have talked about it, that there is a lot of fear-mongering with AI. And one thing I noticed in the paper, you consistently also stress the positive impetus of AI it could have on our society, which is also important to point that out as well. Could you dive in that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I don't know when it became that I was one of the people that's being seen as more positive. It used to be that people thought I was more positive because I thought it was ridiculous that robots were going to take over the world. People might take over the world with robots, but robots themselves are not the actors. So, I mean, it wasn't that positive an argument. But people are like, oh, you're such a Pollyanna that the robots aren't going to, suddenly rise against us and, become human. And it's like, no, that shows ignorance of what it is to be human. But anyway, I digress. The point is that I do think it's really important to recognize that lives have been massively improved. We've had AI for decades. It's increasing. It's becoming more pervasive. The technology is becoming more pervasive. We're becoming richer. More people have these things than ever before. One of the things that's happened in the 21st century, just from the year 2000 to the year 2015, something like half of humanity stopped being in the state of extreme poverty. They moved out of that constant state of food risk. That's incredible. We in Europe barely understand that. We miss like a day or two of food and we're freaking out. But and I don't mean to undermine the people who have for the first time been locked down and had their I had colleagues who were locked down in Italy whose neighbors literally couldn't find food for their kids. So I'm not trying to minimize that. But that was the state a lot of people were in all the time, and that's changed. And a lot, part of it's changed because effective altruism is effective, right? So people have gotten smarter about how they donate money. Part of it's changed because we stopped donating money. A lot of the money that was being donated by governments was getting captured by other governments who were getting money because they had these problems, so they kept the problems, right? Kind of like certain governments who decided to deny that there's a climate crisis when they're run by real estate guys who like to rebuild a lot, But anyway, but instead you got investment from a nation who just wanted to get the resources out. And I'm not saying that was entirely altruistic, but it still just paid wages, and that was more effective at getting help to the people who needed it. But I do think that a big part of it, from what I've read, and this is still open research in the social sciences, but it looks like a big part of it is just mobile phones. That people could find out how much their stuff is actually worth, so they could find a good market for whatever it was they were doing, so they could know what the weather was. We take weather reports for granted, but for like a century, but it wasn't something available to all people. So these things have really, really changed human life. And I don't know anybody who's like sitting around watching a professor on a Saturday afternoon. There's a decent chance that you're also a gamer. People that are gamers think that that's a new art form, or some of them do. And that has pluses and minuses. It's fantastic that we find ways to connect. New ways to connect, new ways to form identities, and new ways to express ourselves. But it also means that we don't have as much motivation to go out and connect with other people directly. I think one of the really interesting and important things about again, at least in Europe, and I don't want to diminish the problems other parts of the world have had, but is that we've had more time to be embedded in our neighborhoods and with our families, and we got back those 2 hours or whatever that we had been spending on commuting a day. And yes, for some people it's been very isolating, but for a lot of people they've connected, to the building that they lived in, if they lived in at least somewhat urban area, or to the, you know, the place they chose to live actually wasn't that bad, you know, and they started connecting with people more like themselves, and they've found that enriching. So at least in Germany, the statistics I saw showed that mental health has improved during COVID. And I just saw new results indicating that fear has declined and trust in the government has improved. People are even less afraid of disease than they used to be. They're less afraid of immigration than they used to be. And I think it's because they've learned that their government really is competent relative to other governments. You know, they hadn't really believed it before. They were believing the hype. So this is, you know, both positive and negative, because you don't really want this large of a crisis to be the thing that communicates to people the facts, you know, that demonstrates, you know, you want some other form of transparency so people can go out and find out who to trust. And I think that's one of the big challenges of AI, going back to these. So if you've got AI as your extended brain and it's going out and finding things, but which reality is it plugging into? Right, and who are you believing? You know, for as your ground source of information. One of my own family members, I don't want to name names, but said to me at some point, "Why do you believe the National Institute of Health, but not the president?" And that person was believing the opposite, right? And I was like, where do I start? As you know, as a scientist, you know, it was the National Institute of Health study that was published in the Lancet. So I was both trusting one of the big prestige journals in the entire academic publication process, and a study that was done with like thousands of people that was, you know, like the scientific method. And the idea that any one person, whether or not they were like a particular politician that we won't, you know, necessarily name, and not anybody current. This was a while ago we had this conversation. But anyway, yeah, it was just sort of it was like you realize then that you're having no basis to start your argument with unless you really have a lot of time, you know. But you have to find some ground on which you think like there's been a regularity that if you look over time, this stuff tends to work. And most people kind of know that about science. I think some people will go out and be really anti-science, anti-rational, but they kind of know that medicine has been improving overall, and so they still mostly believe it. It's very much the George Orwell doublethink sometimes, when they say they don't trust doctors, and then they freak out if they don't have access to a doctor. You know, that's Anyway, sorry, I don't know if I'm digressing too much, if that's the way you wanted to go.
No, at this point I wanted to bring in, because of the collaboration, which is very much to do with what we are doing this year, finding new forms of collaboration with the tech we have now, which of course maybe you want to pitch in on the on this topic.
Yeah, well, I think collaboration and communication is so essential to trust building, and you referred now a lot to these important things of confidence and trust. And I mean, basically, this was always the issue with any type of technology that was brought into society. But of course, because of this very nature, and maybe even just the term artificial intelligence, suddenly we have actually a very wonderful situation, because so many more people feel entitled and encouraged to join this discussion about artificial intelligence. And the interesting thing is now we have a really nice intermingling of voices and opinions coming from the usual directions, the sciences, the academics, but we have also the politicians participating much more in this discussion, but also many laymen. And I think this puts a very interesting position also for cultural institutions, because we are in a certain way a kind of complementary part to the educational system. And I think the more also we really bring this discussion out of the domain and the competence only of the scientists, but in the layman hands, even if probably many things we are discussing are just stupid because we don't have the means to understand it. But participating in the discussion, I think, is extremely important. And this is something I would be very interested to ask you maybe, because you have this super overview of all the European activities. You are advising basically everybody in Europe in these questions. And we always say Europe, but of course Europe is a very diversified way of how policies and governances are taking place. So maybe the question could be, which of the countries is actually most suited to find or to lead a European way that could be coined by a very good combination and balance between bravely going into the technology, not shying away from it, but still considering that the European way, of course, has to be a kind of humanistic way to say it like this.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that was such a large intervention. I'm not sure where to start. I really want to, so there's at least three themes there. One of which is the notion of trust in technology. And one of the things I try to emphasize is that trust is a relationship between peers. You need to figure out who you can trust. And you're basically allowing them to be autonomous, to go out and innovate in ways. And I think that makes more sense between peers. The more powerful an entity gets, the more you need not just trust, but actually accountability and governance and and to be able to demonstrate responsibility. And but when I say that, I'm thinking about governments. We need to be able to hold our governments to account. We need to be able to hold our corporations to account. So we need to be able to understand. I mean, I don't think there's even good models and framings of all the NGOs that have come up and as you mentioned, the incredible role that art plays. That was a digression I want to go down to. So that was one digression. But anyway, let me say, some people think that we ought to trust AI. And you have the European Commission saying we need to make trustworthy AI. And I think that's absolutely false. We don't want people to trust AI. We want them, they trust it too much. They think they understand it. They throw it into this belief that it's human-like, that they've watched Star Wars enough that they get it. And so then they have this robot, and they think that robot, just like the phone, right? They think the robot is an entity with which they have a relationship, but that's false. It's an extension of several corporations and some hackers, right? That's sitting in their home listening to them, right? It's not their friend. It's a device that is controlled, hopefully by them. If it's cyber and it's a legitimate product, then they control it. And if they don't control it, then someone else is having a huge impact on their lives and has access to huge amounts of information about them. And so I think it's really important that we understand, just like that characters in movies are fiction, that robots that we play with are not just fiction but products. They're products that are connected. They have open connections to people we may not even realize that we're having a relationship with. It's like unsafe sex. Yeah. It's unsafe intellectual sex. Anyway. And then the other thing is that I first heard this idea that arts was the means to communicate science to the masses in Edinburgh, which I loved. Very, very good Enlightenment city. I love the city. I don't really like the idea. I kind of, and I don't know, it's important. Communication really matters. But I love art for itself. We all have to find reasons for our lives, but I like putting art at the apex, And if, just like, I also think blue sky research is absolutely essential. So I just said I'm doing something useful. I've gone to a governance school because I saw that there was something that needed to be done. Well, first of all, I think we're basically sort of in a time of warfare right now, where the people are literally using the affordances to assault institutions that create safety for a lot of us. So I think it's very important to pitch in. But secondly, I'm old, right? But I wouldn't be where I am if I hadn't done a huge amount of blue sky research for decades, partly because I was really bad at raising funding. but I kept being able to pursue what was interesting to me. And now I have the resources, like the knowledge resources, to come in and try to tie some knots together and bring people together to solve some problems. Mm-hmm. So I like it when we serve, when we find ways to serve, but I don't like to say that's all art is, and I'm sure that's not what you meant.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think
finally,
we have to make a very big difference between this idea that art can work as a kind of catalyst in this field of communication between the worlds, or whether you expect art to be the explanation for science. I mean, this is not the job of artists. I mean, this should be the job of journalists, of designers, or whatsoever. I think we totally agree with this. Okay, yeah, and I do agree about the catalyst thing. I mean, I think art is a catalyst of a community. It is a form of communication, and when you get, or if you feel like you get a piece of art, it becomes a part of your identity. That you say, yes, I'm aligned with this. I get that. But anyway, then finally about the different. I sort of rebelled against your question about like which European country should lead. I think one of the strengths of Europe
is that there are so many different countries, and they are taking such different tacks. And then they come together and they can solve, they can solve a lot more different kinds of problems. It takes them longer because they have to then negotiate and argue about it. But even that we're getting better at. We're starting to innovate ways that disparate actors can collaborate. And then those innovations that we find, we're trying to then bring out to the rest of the world, because it's an ever more connected world. And if other regions have problems, they become our problems. So it's better to help to use everything we learn to make sure that everybody's doing well. Yeah. So I don't want to say that there's a few countries leading but I will say I've been very impressed by Macron. I think he gets it. I think he gets that. One of the things I loved was that he said at some point, ultimately, the one thing that AI cannot do is my job, to be responsible. And I'm like, exactly. Yeah, yes, that is the most key important thing that I was trying to communicate. And I did some work with the OECD, so maybe he heard from me, but I don't know. But anyway, I totally love that. I also, one of the things I totally love about Germany is that, they've had this interesting connection about how they integrate labor into corporations from back, like the Russian Revolution, basically, but right after, I guess, World War I. And so that has, famously, it again slows some decisions down because, you have to bring the Workers' Council along. But, I was a member of the teaching union in Britain. I was engaged with that. I think it was important. But if you're not sitting on the board, if you're, you would see places where sometimes the union really did disrupt the corporation so much that it collapsed and everybody lost, right? So I think that it makes more sense to have good, strong representation of labor in these important decisions. And how that relates to AI is that in Germany, the labor ministry and the education ministry are with the economics industry together, the three ministries in charge of regulating AI. So apparently that leads to all kinds of contention, but it's nice to have that contention happening in the government, within the government, they're having those discussions. And they really, I think that's cool. Yeah. I don't know that much about other people's policies. I know a bit about what the Swiss are doing. I respect some of the work that their Science Foundation is doing in terms of really looking at the social integration of the technology. I've heard, I used to live in Vienna for a while, and I was back visiting, and they told me about that the digital economy had overtaken the artistic economy there, which is saying something. I don't think the artistic economy went away, but it just meant that a small country of 8 million people was in a decade able to expand and explode their digital, which is great. I think it isn't just I really love the OECD principles of AI, their emphasis on sustainability and human rights, as well as the basic things we need to get straight, which I think the British got straight first, about the accountability and responsibility and transparency, and understanding that AI is not an end to itself, but rather something that needs to be human-centered. But the OECD is, of course, not exactly the EU. But again, that's one of the things we need to be able to do. We need to be able to make agile collaborations. Some things you need geographic contiguity, some things you don't. And we need to find partners. And I think that's empowering for a lot of other people. The fact that the EU was able to force the GDPR through, and right up to the last minute, big tech was saying, no one will do business there. Yeah, right. We're like one of the largest economies in the world. Nobody was going to turn their back on all these rich people with money in their pockets. Of course they were going to actually comply. And now other regions, even small players, if they band together, they can become an important enough market that people will listen and negotiate with them. So we're learning new ways to negotiate with these. Unfortunately, I don't know if they should have been there, but they are there now, mega corporations. So I think I may have taken too long a turn. Sorry.
No, you haven't. Actually, I wanted to continue here a little bit. We have 5 minutes left, so maybe The last question, because we have been talking about this in the last session before, that we need larger entities when it comes to policy and legal laws, because I get the feeling the national policies won't cut it when running up against globally active corporations. It's maybe too slow, so we need the European Union in a way.
Well, no, that's sort of what I was just talking about. Yes, you need things like the European Union, and right now the European Union is leading on that kind of collaboration. But a lot of other regions are also finding out how that giving up some autonomy can actually give you more autonomy, right? So you're giving up autonomy on one level, it gives you more power on another level, and so learning how to coordinate that. And then learning how to fend off assaults. So, like, for example, we're having this problem now with the digital tax that, like, two countries get picked off. We have a rule about consensus. What do we do about that? Well, one thing that you can do is, again, if you get enough other large countries to say, well, okay, we're going to do this, then you don't have to take the whole EU with you initially. And then the other countries can say, oh, yeah, we did want to be a part of that if they want to. So that's. I think that looking ahead, we are going to want to have more agile ways to configure and deal with all kinds of problems. One of the really interesting things, again, about the COVID crisis was that it showed that having such an efficient logistic chain wasn't good. That there were two. You can't just have one, even though if in theory you could have one system, like GPS, we could have one set of satellites, right? It's just better to have redundancy. It's better to pay the extra cost to have, I think right now we have 3 kind of GPS. There's like a European, a Chinese, and an American one. And we had to be really careful when Europe did that. We're like, to America, like, we're totally friends. Yeah, we're totally best friends. But just in case, it's good to have 2. but and that was before the sort of the current lunacy. That was like a decade ago. So. I think that we're also realizing that with respect to other forms of logistics and just making sure people are able to take care of themselves. But it's not a return to complete nationalism and ridiculousness. It's just about saying, let's get the balance right. Let's have multiple ways to thread it. And we have recovered, as far as I know. And again, I haven't kept up with the whole world, but it has been an incredibly agile response and not taking as long as you might think to get to reallocate resources, for example, from businesses to homes because people are at home more.
Last question for the last 2 minutes from my side, because we are here in a university, and there is a lot of discussion now. How should the university of the 21st century look like? Is the old model of a technical university good enough to lead us into this world of AI?
Well, that's a great question, and maybe 2 minutes is a bit short. I would love to see, again, I'd like to see more agility. I think universities or other people will become certification bodies, but I still think there's an advantage to going and becoming a cohort. We definitely saw that in the computer science department at Bath. People came in already very competent computer scientists, but they realized that having that degree and getting to know other people gave them a leg up in the rest of their life and the rest of their ambitions. And sometimes they even learned something, in some classes. But universities are a kind of institution that, of course, we have to continue justifying, and we may have to alter our models to different amounts of time. I mean, Hertie School actually has 3 different ways that you can get through your degree, depending on whether you're working right now or not and how you want to do your master's degrees. So I think we're going to see a lot of that kind of agility. But at the same time, it's not a complete university. And if I want to really get the research done, I need to be able to work with other people from the city of Berlin at other universities. And, hopefully I can.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. It was nice to have you. And,
yeah. And if there's any other questions, you can always try to get me on Twitter.
We will.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah.
See you.
Really
Bye.
great to talk to you. Thank you very much for your input.
To you guys too. And next time in Austria.
Yes.
Hopefully.
We hope so. Great. Wonderful.